Hey guys, welcome to the third episode in my Selling Your Journals series. So, this is a video series, obviously all about selling journals, but also handmade items could apply. And I have two videos before this one on my YouTube channel. The first one talks a little bit about the different platforms where you can sell your journals online. And the second one talks about what you can realistically expect to make, like how much money you can expect to make selling journals. So if you're interested in this topic, be sure to check those videos out also. So in this video, I'm going to be talking all about pricing your journals. So this is kind of a big topic, and I think this video might be a little bit longer than the first two. So I want to cover a lot of information. I feel like this is something that a lot of people just maybe guess or use a formula. There's a couple formulas out there that are recommended for handmade items, and they're based on selling wholesale or with the idea of maybe selling them wholesale. And that doesn't really necessarily work the best for journals. So the formula I'm going to share with you, the one that I use, can be used for any handmade items, and it really gives you a more exact pricing. Makes sure that you cover everything that you need to cover when you're pricing your items. So anyway, we're going to get into all of that towards the end. I just want to talk about a couple issues regarding pricing. Now, when we get to the end, I'm going to give you an example, and I want to walk you through like pricing a junk journal. So don't feel like overwhelmed trying to keep up with what I'm saying, because I created a PDF with all the information, like a step-by-step to follow when you're pricing your journals. So you can just print it out and you'll have that as a guide. So I will leave a link to that PDF in the description box below. All right, so this is a big topic, like I said. The first thing I just wanted to mention is that there is a difference, and I know most of you probably know this, but I want to bring it up anyway, between handmade and mass-produced items, besides the obvious. But pricing those items is very, very different. And I think sometimes, maybe especially consumers who maybe aren't real familiar with handmade, if they don't make things or sell things themselves, wonder, why is handmade so much more expensive than something I can buy in a store? Or if you've ever sold at like a craft fair, you'll hear people say like, oh, I could make that for a lot cheaper myself. So one of the biggest factors that goes into why handmade is so much more expensive is the labor, right? So mass-produced items often are produced with very cheap labor. So that's a major difference right there. And also, obviously, handmade items are usually one of a kind. They're made by an artist, so you are also paying for their talent. So that's another big difference. But mass-produced items, the people, like these big companies, they all sort of have a very even playing field. In order for them to be competitive in their markets, they really can't fluctuate too much on their pricing, and the suppliers that supply the pieces that they need to make the things they make, they can't fluctuate too far from each other in their pricing in order to remain competitive. So they really kind of have this more even playing field, whereas people who are making things themselves, right? We're just like individuals at home making things, and the supplies that we buy, it can vary widely from one artist to another. So some artists are, especially I would think maybe hobby artists, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between someone who has a hobby business versus someone who has a real business. But they may just buy their supplies retail. So that means they go into a Michael's or a Hobby Lobby and they buy supplies there and use those things to make the things that they're selling. That's very different than someone who buys their supplies wholesale. So obviously mass-produced items, they're buying wholesale at huge volumes, so they can get really low prices. It's a little harder when you're an artist trying to make things at home and try to find supplies really cheap. It takes a long time sometimes to source good quality materials that are really affordable. I'm going to start coughing. I know it. My allergies are acting up, and I'm going to have to keep taking a drink of water. I'm sorry. Because I know I'll start coughing. So the cost of labor, also, I mentioned mass-produced items are often produced with very cheap labor, so you have that factor. And even among big companies in the last decade or so, you've had some major disruptors to the mass market because of places like Amazon and Walmart. They've even made it difficult for like mid-sized to big companies to compete with them because their prices are so low. And the reason why they can do that is because they're so big. They have so much buying power. And besides that, they, like Walmart, for example, they operate on very like razor thin margins, profit margins. And we're going to talk about profit in a couple minutes. But they can operate on super low profit margins, and most companies cannot survive. A business needs profit in order to survive, to grow, and everything that they need to be successful. And most companies can't compete with that. And the reason, I think I've read this, and this is correct, I'm not an economic expert or an expert on any of this, but I'm pretty sure I read the reason why Walmart can operate on such thin margins is because of the sheer volume of sales that they do. They're like all over the world, and they're one of the biggest companies in the world, and that hurts and has hurt. I'm sure you've seen not just like mom and pop shops, but even like big stores are closing all over, and they're finding it very hard to compete with companies like Walmart, Amazon, that sort of thing. So bottom line there is like you can never compare like how to price your items by looking at what is being sold in stores. So I think most of you probably know that, but I just wanted to mention that right up front. So now I want to talk a little bit about a hobby business versus a real business. And I put that in quotes because I don't want to be disrespectful of someone that's just selling things as a hobby. But I'm trying to differentiate because there is a difference between selling as a hobby and selling as a business. And the most simple way to describe that is a true business makes a profit. And if you are only pricing your items to cover your material costs and maybe even some of your time, but you don't make a profit, then you really are just a hobby business. So you have to have profit for having a true business. So I have some notes here. I've actually got like pages of notes, so I'm going to be referring to them because I don't want to forget anything I want to cover and keep myself on track. So when you have a hobby business, you're just covering like your materials, sometimes your labor. In a true business, you're covering all the costs involved in running your business. So not just the materials and the labor for the items, but any things that you have to pay for in your business needs to be covered by the items that you sell, because that's the revenue or the sales, the money that is coming into your business. It needs to cover all of your costs, which means you need to know what all of your expenses are. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. I do want to mention, so before I mention that, I just looked at my notes and saw something I told myself I didn't want to forget to mention. But before I say that, the profit that a business ends up with, that is the money that is what you use to pay yourself. So if you're trying to make a living at selling, that profit is what you need to pay yourself. So you cover all of your expenses, and then what is left, you pay yourself with that money, but not all of it, because a chunk, and a big chunk, has to go to taxes. So your gross profit gets divided up, and two of the things that it gets divided up into is taxes and then your paycheck. And you can also put some aside as profit. And I want to talk a little bit more about that in just a second. I do want to mention here, though, that even if you are just selling as a hobby, you do actually still need to pay taxes on that money. So even if you're not like registered as a business or anything like that, as far as the government's concerned, if you're selling things for money, you need to claim that as income. So you would claim that on your personal income taxes and pay tax on that. The only difference in paying the taxes for someone that just has a hobby versus someone that has a business is you can't deduct your expenses if you have a hobby business. So that's the difference. But you're still supposed to pay taxes on that money that you're making. So I just wanted to mention that. Another thing I want to mention is think about, like, if you have a hobby maker and someone running a business, and just for the sake of this explanation or this example, if you had two items that were essentially the same, right, side by side, the person that is just covering their materials and maybe some of their time, their item's going to be priced lower than the person who is running a business, right? Because they need to cover all their fees that are associated with selling their item, overhead, and then have that money left over, that profit at the end, to pay their taxes and to pay themselves. So their item is going to be priced higher. So there's like a potential for it to hurt a business if there are other people selling the same things for a lot less. Now, that is not to admonish anyone, so please don't take that way at all, because you can still sell. Even if there are people who are pricing only to cover their materials and you're pricing because you're running a business and you need to charge more, you can absolutely still charge more and sell your items. I don't have a problem selling my journals at the prices that I charge. You will see a wide range of pricing, and partly that is because some people are just covering the cost of their materials. Some people don't really know how to price, so they're just kind of making up a number that they think sounds reasonable. There's other issues sometimes that go into why people don't price higher, and I'll talk about that in a minute too. Hopefully I'll remember that. But I just kind of wanted to point out that there is a difference, between having a hobby and having a business. And, there's room for everybody. And like I said, you won't have any problems. Like, don't feel like you can't charge more because you really feel like you need to. Once you go through this calculation that we're going to do together at the end, you're going to see why handmade journals cost so much, and that you're not making a killing on it, even though it seems like you might if it's so expensive. You will see like all the expenses that you have to cover, but you can still do that and sell your journals at the appropriate price if you're trying to run a business. So don't be like scared off by that. All right, let me see where I'm at now. So part of that, let me just kind of stay with that little topic there for a minute. Part of how you sell journals that cost more, well, first of all, you need to be able to justify the price. It can't just be because it took you, tons of hours and you spent a lot of money on your materials and you're just trying to cover everything properly. You need to be able to convey that value to your potential customers. So your value has to be there. You have to back up that price with your product, of course. Otherwise, you might not sell more than one or two. You won't get repeat customers coming back if they find out that the quality just isn't there. Oh, I was getting ready to hit stop on my camera because I thought the camera stopped, but it didn't. So let me just continue. Sorry. So now I lost my train of thought. So it really has to do with how you position yourself in the marketplace. That's kind of a whole other topic that has to do with marketing. And I am going to do some videos about that coming up. But as long as you show your product in a way that conveys that it can command the higher price, you will be able to sell your journals. Part of that has to do with having like good photography, maybe having videos, good quality videos that show your journal and like the whole thing, doing a flip through so people can really see what they're getting, and then they can determine for themselves if they want to pay that price. But having I'm getting off the topic, like with marketing and everything, so having really good photos on Etsy and Instagram are really important, because if your photos are poor quality, it may subconsciously, even if someone doesn't consciously think this, they may subconsciously think that it's a lower quality journal if the photos aren't good quality, right? I mean, that kind of makes sense, I think. So that's really important. So that's, like I said, that's another topic, but where you position yourself and how you show the value of your journal, those are things that you need to do. And then of course have a good quality product, and then you can justify those higher prices. So, all right, let's get into talking about pricing. So I mentioned in the beginning that there are formulas that you will often hear suggested for how to price your handmade items. If you go to Google and you type in how to price handmade, you will see a couple versions, but basically the formula that is usually recommended is materials, the cost of your materials, plus labor, plus overhead. And I'm going to talk more in detail about all these things in just a minute. So you have those three things you add together, and you multiply that by 2. That is your wholesale price. So even if you aren't ever planning to sell wholesale, this is still something that you account for in coming up with the price you're going to charge. And if you ever did decide to sell wholesale, this is a good formula to use. You really don't want to look into wholesale unless you have items that are something that is pretty low cost for you and that you can reproduce quickly. Like jewelry is really great for wholesale. Journals are not. One-of-a-kind items, you'll never be able to use this formula and have a price that people will actually be willing to pay. So I want to say that right up front. Like, this formula I'm telling you doesn't work for junk journals. But I'm going to share it with you because if you Google, this is the formula you're probably going to see. So you multiply that by 2, and that's your wholesale price. And then you double that price, multiply that price by 2, and that is your retail price, which is the selling price. And the thought behind that is you would sell your item to a shop wholesale. So you're making profit selling it at wholesale. And then that shop needs to be able to turn around and sell that same item for a profit for them. But it needs to be at a price that people are willing to pay. So that is not something that's easy to do with journals, mainly because of the labor part. So it's really the more detailed, the more like one of a kind your item, the more you want to have a very detailed calculation that accounts for all of your costs. And that's what we're going to do in this video. That's what I'm going to share with you. So let me just look at my notes again here. Well, one of the things that is not covered in that formula I just shared are fees. So if you are selling on Etsy, you have Etsy fees and PayPal fees. They take a big chunk of your money. Etsy still has like one of the lowest percentages that they take, or fees, I should say, that they take. Compared to like Amazon Marketplace, or what is that called? Amazon Handmade. Some of the other marketplaces, eBay, they all have higher fees. So Etsy still has lower fees, but in general, it's still going to take a big chunk of your money. You're going to see that when we do the calculation. So yeah, Etsy and PayPal fees. If you're not selling on Etsy, say you're selling right directly on Instagram, or if you have a standalone website, then in those cases, you will still have your payment processing fees. So if you're selling on Instagram and you're just using PayPal, you'll pay PayPal fees, which are going up in 2 days. And I want to mention that in just a minute because it's a lot higher than it was before. And if you have a standalone website, you'll either pay PayPal fees or maybe Stripe if you use Stripe. That's a great payment processor. I love Stripe. I use that for one of my courses, and they have their own fees. So you've got to account for that when you are pricing. And when you're doing your materials, labor, overhead, I mean, you could include your fees in that overhead number, but I like using the formula that I'm going to share with you because it breaks each thing out that you are paying, so you can kind of see where your money is going. All right, so let me see where I am at here. So the first thing that you need to know, the first piece of information you need to know when you are coming up with your pricing is the cost of your materials. So we're going to start with materials. Now, with junk journals, that can be really challenging, right? Because every journal is different. This is also the trick with selling one of a kind. Every single time you sell a journal, you are having to figure out how much materials have cost you to make that journal. So this is one of the reasons why it's hard to make money and make a living selling journals or like one of a kind items, because every single time you make the item, you have to go through the pricing and figuring out how much you've spent, and then taking photos and doing a video and creating a listing. Whereas if you have a shop selling something that's an easily reproducible item, then you make the thing one time and you take a picture or a series of pictures, maybe video, you create one listing, and then you just renew that listing as it sells. You're not recreating and figuring out the pricing every single time you make or sell something. If it's something that's like jewelry, where you can make one time and just keep selling it and not have to like go through the entire pricing process, listing process every single time. So because you really need to account for all the time you're spending on your business. So if you are really trying to make some money at doing this, this is like one of those things that takes a lot of time that people don't really necessarily think of before they begin or account for when they're pricing. But technically, if you are doing things right, you're going to account for all this time, right? It's the time that it takes you to find the supplies. So with junk journals, like you're constantly looking for ephemera, books, whatever the things you like to put in your journals. There's the time that you're searching for those items. You technically should be counting that as your work time. What else? So, right, there's time gathering supplies. And then when you're working on one particular journal, it's the time to pull all those supplies together for that journal. Again, that takes a lot of time. So you need to account for that. So I don't want to get too far ahead of myself here. So we're talking about pricing materials. And I'm kind of starting to talk about labor right now when I'm talking about the time. But let's just talk about materials right now. So say you have pulled all the materials together that you want to use for your journal. So how do you figure out how much that costs you? Especially when you're using things like books. Maybe you're using a cookbook and you're only using one page out of that cookbook. So I'll give you a little tip. I'll tell you what I do. And this makes this process so much easier. When I buy something, so this is only going to work moving forward if you haven't done this already, but try this. When you buy something, use a pencil and write very lightly somewhere on the thing that you bought how much you paid. And then when you pull all your stuff together for a project, you can keep a running list. So you can do this at the end when you have your whole journal together, and then you go through and you write down like what you used in it, or you can keep a running list as you are gathering your materials. You'll find what works for you. I actually do it at the end. But like I said, when you buy things, write down how much you paid for it. And then when it comes to pulling something from that for your journal, you can figure out how much the piece that you're pulling out costs you. So for example, if you bought a book for $5 and the book has 100 pages in it, again, this is the time thing, right? You might have to count the pages. You buy a pack of postcards and you pay $4 for it. You need to count your postcards, see how many are in there. And then you can figure out if you use one postcard in your journal or one page from that $5 book, you need to figure out how much each one of those postcards or pages cost. So yes, I literally do this for every journal. And that's how you track your prices. So writing them on there makes it a lot easier when it comes time, because you're not going to remember how much you paid for something. You can keep a spreadsheet if you want to. I do that for my supplies, not my ephemera. Like I said, I write directly on the piece of ephemera, on the box, on the inside page or something, just very lightly with pencil so I can erase it. My ledger papers, I pay all different prices for them. So I make sure I write on them, or I put them like all together in a Ziploc bag, like my ledger papers, and then I write on the bag how much each sheet cost me. So I know what I paid. Don't forget to include shipping if you bought it on eBay or something like that. And then you need to figure out the like per item cost. So then when it comes time to price out your journal, you will very easily be able to write down every single thing that you use in your journal. I know that's really tedious, like writing down what every single page, every single piece of ephemera that you put in your journal. But like I said, if you're doing this as a business, you need to know how much you are spending, because you're spending all this money to buy these supplies, and then you're putting them into something to sell. If you're trying to run a business and make money doing this, then you need to know how much you have going out the door and how much you have coming in. So I know it's tedious, but if you set yourself up to like be a little bit organized with it from the get-go, it's not too bad. And like I said, you just kind of keep a running list of everything that you've used, your trims, fabrics, same thing. You just kind of estimate, if you buy a yard of fabric and you're using 8 inches of it, you need to figure out like how much per inch that yard of fabric cost, and then how much 8 inches is in your journal. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense for that piece. So when you get to the end of making your journal, you're going to have your material cost. Now you also have some other material costs associated with selling this journal, and that is the shipping materials that you're going to use to send out your journal after it sells. So you need to account for the costs of that. So whatever you wrap your journals with. So I wrap mine like in tissue paper and then bubble wrap. And then I put them in a box and usually add bubble wrap or some of those like air pillows to the box. You got to account for all that packaging. So that goes into your material costs. So I think that's everything for materials. So the next piece is your labor. So let me check where I'm at on my notes here. All right. So let me back up. We're going to keep kind of like a little running list. I have a pen and paper. I don't know if I want to do it this way or not. So we're going to pretend that the material costs for this journal that we're going to be selling was, say, $15 in materials for the journal itself. Okay, so I'm writing this down, $15. And then I also add a little bit to cover incidentals like glue and thread, things that are hard to price, but there's still things that you are buying and using in your business, and you want to cover that in your pricing. You can do this under your overhead, which we're going to get to in just a minute, but I don't really do it that way. I just add a little bit to the cost of the journal. And if I'm doing like an elaborate, fully decorated journal, I will add like $1, like $1 to cover like all like the glue and I'm trying to think of some other things, thread, the use of your tools. Like tools are things that you might have to replace. Like I broke my scissors, my Tim Holtz scissors, the handle broke. So I'm going to need to replace them. That's something you can cover in your overhead. Like I said, we'll talk about that in a second, but just for the sake of materials, and I'm counting kind of like glue and tape, those kinds of things, I'm adding $1, right? So $1 for the incidentals, and then 88 cents for packaging, right? So the bubble wrap, the tissue paper, and the box. We're going to call that 88 cents. All right, so we are at $16.88 for our material cost. So I'm writing this down. Okay, we're going to have like a little thing here. We're building up our costs. And like I said, I've got a PDF for you, so you don't have to like try to really follow along with what I'm writing down or saying. All right, so labor. So obviously there's the labor of how long it takes you to make your journal. That's obvious, right? So the way I track my time is you can do it two ways. You can write it down every single time you sit down to work. You can write down like your start time and your finish time, or you can use like the timer on your phone and just hit the stopwatch, or no, this is timer, not stopwatch. Well, whichever one it is, I can't remember. That tracks your time, and then you just hit the stop button when you're finished, and then you can come back later and restart it and stop it, and it saves like the last time that you were at. So do that. Do not assume like how long you spent on that journal, because that's what I did in the beginning. I'm like, yeah, I think that probably took me like 4 hours to make that. And then the next time I like was real careful and tracked every minute that I worked on a journal that was similar, and it was like 8 hours. I was way, way off. Time flies when you're having fun, and you really want to account for your time. So you want to track it very, very closely. All right. So that's your labor. But remember, when I was talking about collecting your materials and, buying things and procuring things for your journals, you want to account for that time. Now, I know that most of us are not like spending time buying things for one project. You buy things, you go to a thrift store, or you spend a little time looking at eBay. Okay. I think we're back now. All right. So yes, so you're not spending time looking for items per project. I know that. After you do things for a while, you just can kind of gauge approximately how much time you spent on finding things, right? You just need to have a way to account for all the time you spend in your business doing all the things. It's really hard. So you just make your best guess. So you might just want to add like 15 minutes of time for buying materials and then gathering them together for your journal. It's actually probably a little bit more than that. And you can spend a lot of time, right? Like futzing around your craft room and thinking, oh, this could work, that could work. Or maybe you think of something while you're working and you go and get it. So, it's not a perfect science. And it is one of the things that makes selling journals a little bit challenging, a little different than some other kinds of crafts. So there's a lot of these little kind of like gray areas. So just do the best you can to estimate, okay? But I just wanted you to be aware of like the kinds of things to be thinking about. All right, so once you kind of cover for your time, that's the time getting things together. The other time that goes into this is making the listing, right? So you have to take photos of your journal. You might want to do a video. So the time you spend doing your photos, editing them, uploading them to your computer, creating the listing if you're selling on Etsy. If you do videos, it's the time to make the video. If you do any editing, uploading it, writing the description, if you're doing this on YouTube, answering comments. I mean, this is all time that goes into your business. So you probably want to add a little bit to your labor for pricing wise for those things. So, I don't know, 15 minutes. Well, it's longer than probably 15 if you're doing a flip through. So, just kind of estimate how much time you spent on doing all of that, and you add that to your labor. All right. Now, what about your hourly rate, your labor rate? So, what do I want to say about this here? This is not the money that you are paying yourself. The labor rate, and I'm not a real expert, super clear on this, but the labor rate is not something like at the end, you're going to say, oh, I'm keeping, if I charge $15 an hour and it took me 3 hours, that's $75. So I'm keeping $75 of my sale price. That's not how it works. What you're paying yourself is coming out of the profit at the end. So the labor rate, this is just, again, a piece of the formula that you need to have in there to account for your time. And like I said, it's covering all the time that you're spending on making the journal and selling it. So it's just a number that you need to know and put in this formula, okay? So I think most makers, and you can decide whatever your price is. So, but I think a lot of makers, like the average is like $15 to $20 an hour, right? So like, I think $10 to $15, depending on where you live, is minimum wage. But if you start using numbers like $20, $40 an hour, even though your talent might be really worth that, you will find it very hard to sell these kinds of items with that hourly rate built in. Okay. So I use $15 an hour for my journals. When I'm figuring out pricing for some other things, like just putting together, something that doesn't require a lot of like creativity, some like my supplies, things like that. I don't use a $15 an hour rate. I use like a $10 an hour rate because it's not requiring any kind of artistic ability, talent, anything like that. So I do use a lower rate for that. So let's say we're just going to use $15 an hour, and let's say it was 4 hours to make this journal that we're making. I feel like my camera's like crooked here. Okay, so labor. I'm writing this down on my little sheet here. So we've got our materials, and then labor, $15 an hour times 4 equals 60. Okay, so you're keeping track of all this. This is our materials and this is our labor. Okay. Now, technically here is where you could add in some overhead. Overhead, you'll often hear like 10%. So you take materials plus labor and then take 10% of that and add that as your overhead. Most of us are working at home. We don't have the same kind of overhead as some businesses. Like I'm not trying to cover the cost of like electricity that I run in my craft room. I'm not paying rent, but those are the kinds of things that would be considered overhead. So it's things that aren't costs associated with the products you're selling. It's all the other incidentals that it costs to run your business. So, but you really should add something to cover like ink, like your printer ink, printer paper. the things like the tools I mentioned, like, replacing some of your tools over time. You might need to buy more staples, like little things like that, office supplies, that sort of thing. So you can add a little bit to all of your products to cover those costs. There's a couple ways to do it. I think they recommend small businesses figure out like how much their overhead costs. So all of those things I just mentioned, how much a month you're spending on those things. You have to figure that out, and then figure out about how many on average products you sell a month. This is really hard for what we do, right? Because you might just sell a different amount every month. It's really hard to come up with an average, but that's how small businesses are often recommended to do it this way. And then you figure out how many products on average you sell a month, and then you divide that overhead cost by the number of products you're selling. And then that way you can spread the cost of your overhead among all those products. And that's how you add that to your price. So that doesn't really work for us so well. So you can just add a little bit, like, 50 cents or something for each product. So do I want to do that? I'm not going to add that on here just to keep the numbers a little bit cleaner, but that is one way you can do that, okay? Is add a little bit of overhead to cover all those incidentals. Let me check my notes here. So, okay. So right now we have our materials at $16.88 and our labor at $60. So you add those two together, right? So that is 76. I thought I wrote this down on my little sheet. 76.88. Okay, 76.88. That is your cost of goods sold. Okay, that's like a little technical marketing business term for you there. It's often abbreviated COGS. I have really terrible handwriting. Okay, 76.88. That's our cost of goods sold. Now, so how do you figure out what to charge from that? Okay, we're getting to that, I promise. Sorry, I'm looking at my notes because I don't want to forget anything. So what we're going to need to figure out next is our profit margin. Okay, so this is why I said don't worry about trying to like really figure out exactly what I'm saying here. This is all going to be written down on that PDF. But once you have your cost of goods sold, the next thing we want to figure out is your profit margin. Now, you get to decide what your profit margin is, what you want your profit margin to be. Now, what I've learned, because I asked several experts that help handmade sellers, so like some coaches out there, and they recommend, and both of them said this, and I've read this also online in a couple different places, so I feel good about this percentage, but they said handmade goods should be really sold no less than 50% profit margin. So that is kind of a starting point for you. Sometimes, you can go higher than that as you get known. Some artists, people can command much higher profit margins. Luxury brands, they have enormous, crazy profit margins, 200, 300%. But that's because they've positioned themselves to be selling like luxury items in the marketplace. That's where positioning comes in. So that's a whole like marketing thing involved with that, but we're not going to get that fancy here. We're just trying to make a little bit of money, right? So 50% is really what you should aim for. Now, having said that, if you're just starting out, you might want to be willing to accept a lower profit margin, but still making some profit, so you don't feel like you're losing money. It may take a little bit of time for people to get to know you and for you to kind of figure some things out. and be able to charge higher prices. So you may start out charging lower prices, but don't charge so low that you are losing money. That's why it's important to do this calculation. So you're aiming for 50%, but like I said, you may have to go with less. But if you're still getting like 20, 30%, you might be okay with starting there, right? You can always start lower and raise your prices as you get more experience and get known in your, in the niche. So we're going to aim for 50%. Let's see. Sorry, I'm looking at my notes because I'm afraid I'm going to go out of order and forget to do something, and then I'll have to back up. So what you're going to do is you need to play around with some prices. So at this point, when I have my cost of goods sold, so in this example, it's $76. Once you do this a few times, you'll get to know, like, if that's your costs, you'll be able to kind of ballpark guess what your selling price is going to be based on that. And by looking at that number, I can already guess that my selling price is probably going to need to be around $200. And you'll see why very soon. So I'm going to start with that. And what you're going to do is you're going to start with 200 and you're going to do this little formula calculation and you're going to see what your profit margin is. If your profit margin is like way below that, now for me, like I sell my journals at 50% profit margin. Every once in a while, like the really detailed, really special ones will be a little bit more than that. But because I spend so much time on those, I actually don't get that much profit. The labor is always what kills you. The best you can do to get your labor down, you're going to see that is the biggest chunk, because what did we say? It was $60 for labor and only $16 in your materials. Labor is always going to be so much more with junk journals, right? Because they're so labor intensive to make. So, yeah. So I was going to say, like, I think I've sold some journals maybe closer to like 56, 57% profit, but I don't think I've sold any journals for more than that because of the labor time. So, so you're going to play around. And if you find out that your profit margin is like 10% or just really low and not what you were hoping for, you need to go back and change the price, increase the price, and then do the calculation again. And I do this for every single journal, every single thing I sell. This is the process I do. And I just play around and redo the calculations until I get to that 50%. Some of my other items that I sell in my Etsy shop, I sell at a lower profit margin. But with Handmade, you want to make 50% be your goal. That really should be where you are at, and you really don't want to be too much below that unless you just are starting out, like I mentioned. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to start with this price we're making up, right? So we're starting with 200. So I'm writing 200 down. The very next piece that you need to know is how much it's going to cost to ship that item. It might sound like I'm jumping ahead, but the reason why you need to figure out how much the shipping is because we also need to find out our Etsy and PayPal fees. So you can't figure them out until you figure out the shipping, because your fees are charged on your price plus shipping. So that number, those numbers combined, is how they determine your fees. And these are all things that we're going to be subtracting off of our price. So you've got to figure out what those are first. So that means you need to weigh your journal. So this is something, you can't determine your price for your journal until you're completely finished your journal. So when you're done, you need to gather the packing materials. You don't have to actually pack it, but just gather the materials that you're going to use to pack your journal, including the box. Journals you want to send in a box. I ship almost everything in bubble mailers, but journals, because they're thick, I do send my kitty dories in bubble mailers, but like a little golden book junk journal, because they're thick, you need to send those in a box. So, and the box is kind of heavy. And when you're weighing your item, it's the whole entire package. The post office wants to know how much your whole entire package weighs. So you need the box and the packaging and your item. Okay. So everything that's going to go in there. And you also need a little scale. So this is one of those like business purchases that you really do need if you're shipping things. They're very low cost. You just need a little kitchen scale. You can pick one up on Amazon. And I weigh all of my packages on that scale. So you're going to weigh your package. You will be shocked at how much, if you haven't done this before, junk journals can weigh. The book cover is heavy, and depending on how much you load it down with like ephemera and how big it is and everything, it can weigh a lot. I looked before I made this video at my Etsy shop, and the last junk journal I sold was a Valentine junk journal, and it was a fully decorated journal, and it was 1 pound 10 ounces, so it's quite heavy. And once you get over a pound, it automatically has to ship priority, and priority is more expensive than first class. So you're already talking like, okay, we're going to be getting up there in shipping cost here. I don't do free shipping. I have calculated it, I think, on all of my items, and I lose money on my profit. I don't make any profit if or very little on some things if I do free shipping. So that's another topic for another day, but especially on something heavy like this, I really do not recommend doing free shipping. I mean, all of your money is going to go out the door if you don't have the customer cover the shipping. So really recommend charging shipping. So you're going to weigh your item. What else did I want to say about that? Okay. So if you're on Etsy, how you can figure out how much your item is going to cost once you weigh it, you have a couple options. You can go right into your Etsy shop and pull up listings and like start creating a listing and put the weight in there. That's one way to do it. Or you can just go to the U.S. Postal Service calculator they have online. I think it's usps.com/postalcalc, CALC. And you can put in all the information for your package, and it will tell you how much it costs to ship. Now, you say, well, it depends on where I'm shipping it to, right? Yes. So when I do this, I actually, I just use Etsy for this. But if you're using the postal calculator, you're going to have to make up a zip code. And what I recommend, and I do this also in Etsy, is I figure out what the most expensive shipping is going to cost. So for me, I live on the East Coast. So shipping to the West Coast costs the most. So I want to make sure that if someone buys from the West Coast, that I've covered all my fees. If I use like, the East Coast shipping, and it ends up being bought by someone on the West Coast, then I didn't calculate the fees right. And you still have to pay the fees to Etsy, but then you didn't cover them in your pricing. So I use West Coast as my gauge. I do sell to Canada, which is much higher, but I am not going to base my pricing on shipping to Canada. I just know that if someone in Canada buys, I am going to lose some more money because it's that much higher. And that's just a loss I'm willing to take. For my Canadian friends. I actually have a lot of customers from Canada. And I know I have a lot of international friends, and people ask me all the time if I will please ship internationally. And this is why I can't. It's even more expensive to ship overseas. And I cannot afford to take the loss that the fees would cost. It eats up all of your profits. Not as much on like expensive items like junk journals, but on like smaller like ephemera kits and just the products in my shop, I actually lose money if I ship internationally. So I know people do it. I don't know if they just charge a lot higher like prices on their items or what, or they just don't know. A lot of people, I don't think, really calculate all of their expenses, and they don't really realize what's going in and out. So All right, so that's a long-winded way to say you need to figure out what your shipping is going to be. So for this example, this 1 pound, if we use like that 1 pound, 10 ounces to ship, for me, the most expensive shipping was California. And that's $11.69 on a package that heavy. Now you could, if you want, take an average and calculate like shipping to the different zones across the US and then take an average. You could do that also. But just for the sake of this, we are going to say, I know I wrote some numbers down so I don't have to calculate it. Let's see, $11.69, right? So for purposes of our calculation, we're going to use that $11.69 shipping, add to our $200 price. Okay, so that's $211.69. Now you can calculate your fees because your fees are charged on the shipping and the price. So let's see what the fees would be. So, fees. So Etsy charges 5% of the shipping and product price, and that's your Etsy fees. So in this example, I wrote it down somewhere below, so I'll figure it out in just a second. But you'll take 5% of $211.69. Remember, this is all in the PDF, so don't worry about if you're not following along on this part. Then you need to figure out your PayPal fees. Again, if you're not selling on Etsy and you're just selling and using PayPal, then you would just use this PayPal number. So you take that same number. So you're going to, let me back up a minute. I'm running ahead of myself. $211.69 times 5%. Put that number to the side. That's your Etsy fees. Then take that same number, $211.69, and multiply that by the PayPal fees. PayPal is raising their fees in 2 days on August 2nd. It's July 31st when I'm filming this. And their fees were 3% plus a flat 25 cents. Starting August 2nd, that is going to be 3.9% plus a flat 49 cents. That is a pretty big jump. And I'm already seeing like how much less I'm going to be ending with because of those fees. So it is what it is. So then you have your Etsy fee and your PayPal fee. Okay. So you're putting that number to the side for a minute. Let me look on my little note and see if I did that. I did. And I forgot the listing fee. You should count your Etsy listing fee, which is 20 cents for every listing. So count that in your Etsy fees. So, all right. So I didn't write that down. I wrote that down below. So my fees there in this example were $19.53, right? That is a big chunk, right? That's just money that you're just going to give to Etsy and PayPal. So $20 on a $200 journal is just fees. So what you're doing is we're putting that little fee number to the side and we're going to go back to our price, right? $200. This is where we're going to be figuring out the profit margin. So $200, you need to subtract your cost of goods sold from that number, right? That's your materials and your labor. So that comes off of 200. And forget the shipping right now. You only need that to figure out your fees, okay? So you just ignore the shipping right now. We're doing this to determine the price that you're going to charge. So $200 minus the cost of goods sold, $76.88. And that is, sorry, I should have highlighted this because I can't use my calculator in real time because that's on my phone. I don't have an old-fashioned calculator handy. So that leaves us with $104.12. Okay, subtracted the cost of goods sold. From that number, you're going to subtract those fees. So I'm taking 104.12 minus 19.53, and what is left is one. Oh shoot, no, that's not right. Let's see. Subtract your fees of 19.53 from. I'm sorry. See, I looked at my numbers wrong. It doesn't matter. It's still the same formula. I just added it wrong. So 200 minus our cost of goods sold was actually 123.12. Then you subtract your fees of $19.53, and that leaves you with $104.12. Okay, that is your gross profit. That is the number that you get to keep. So out of the $200 price, you keep 104. That, remember, is not like your pay. So you're keeping it, but not like all for yourself, not for your paycheck, because out of that, you need to pay your taxes. And I'll talk about how you do that in just a minute. Now you figure out your profit margin. Once you know your gross profit, you can figure out your profit margin. And remember, we want to come up with 50%. So you take this number and you divide it into 200. So you take your gross profit and divide it into that price that you're playing with. And when I do that, when I divided that, let's see, did I write that down? I have way too many notes here. So yes, you come up with, I think I actually wrote it down on my desk. I don't know what I did with it. I did the calculation yesterday with this number, and yes, it was over 50%. I think it was 52%. Okay, so you divide that number, and I ended up with a 52% profit margin. That's great. So yes, 52%. I just saw it on my notes. So that equals 52%. So yeah, you've met your goal of your 50% profit margin. You could go a little bit lower on that. So that tells me that if I want to keep it at 50%, I can do a little bit less than that. If for some reason this percentage comes out to really low and you're like, oh no, 10, 20%, that's not where I want to be, you go back and you redo that whole calculation with a different price. So you would say, okay, 200 wasn't enough. Like say your cost of goods sold was a lot more. Then 200 left you with like a 20% profit. Then you need to go back and play with a different price. Try 225, try 250, but then you got to rework all the numbers again and see what your profit margin is. That is how you account for all of your costs, all of your materials, all of your labor, your fees, your incidentals, your overhead, all of that. So that's really what you want to do for every item. And remember, like I said, if you're just starting out, you may not be able to command, $200 for your journals. So there's a couple ways to handle that. One is you might want to start by making simpler journals, not journals that take you 4 hours to make. So something that takes less time will probably also require less materials. So you'll have a lower material cost. Finding your materials at lower prices helps. So, estate sales and thrift sales, if you can do that, you will get items at lower cost than if you were to go to a store and buy them. So those are just a couple things to consider. Now, I wanted to say something really quickly that reminded me about pricing and starting out. I see a lot of people pricing their journals really low, and I don't know if it's because they haven't worked out the pricing and they're just kind of making up a number that they think it probably should be sold for, or maybe they have worked out just like their materials and they're just trying to cover the cost of their materials plus labor, and they think that number that they came up with is probably what it costs. Like for example, if you go to Etsy and you type in little golden book junk journals, there's a lot of journals in the $50 range. And as you can see from that calculation we did, all of those different expenses, I would be really surprised if that person is making a profit selling a journal for $50. Did you really only spend, maybe a couple hours making that journal? Because if it took you 4 or 5 hours, and and you spent a lot of money on materials to make that, you may not be making any profit. Now, this could also be someone that is just doing this to cover the cost of their materials, right? They're not trying to run a business, so that might be priced right for them. But if you're trying to make some money, I have a feeling that if that's the case for some of those people selling the $50 journals, then they might want to revisit their pricing. Now, I know one of the fears, I gotta take a drink of water. I know one of the fears that some people have is that if they charge more, it's going to be less likely to sell. And that really is not necessarily true, and it might actually be the exact opposite. So, especially for handmade items, right? Yes, we always look for the cheapest price when we're shopping, but that's usually shopping for those like mass market kinds of goods where you can find the same item in multiple stores. So price comparison shopping makes sense. But when it comes to handmade, people really are not shopping based on price. Typically, most people know when they're buying handmade, it's really a special item. It's probably one of a kind. Lots of time went into making that item. They expect to pay more. So the thing that can happen is that if somebody sees a handmade item and it's priced a lot lower than similar items, they might think that it's because it's less quality. Like they might say, well, maybe they're only selling it for $50 because they really didn't spend that much time making it. Maybe they only spent an hour on it and it wasn't put together real. The kinds of things that people might think. Most of this is subconscious. But when we see prices on handmade goods, we typically assume that they're going to be expensive. And like I said, if your journals are a lot less than what's being sold out there, that might not actually be an incentive for somebody to buy. They may actually think it's because it's lower quality. So that's something to keep in mind. But really, at the end of the day, I think the most important thing is to really know what you are spending and, get yourself organized with your supplies, your materials, how much they're costing you. If you are doing this as a business, I recommend two things. Is having a credit card that is just for your business. So you do not want to mix your business expenses with your personal expenses and think you're going to be able to keep track. I mean, it's really a pain to try to do that. And it's really easy to just kind of be like, well, I won't really count that or this. Like, to keep it like really clean and easy to manage, I really recommend having a separate credit card that you use just to buy your supplies. And this will also be very eye-opening because you will see very quickly just how much money is going out the door if you have all of your expenses in one place. And then you get your statement at the end of the month, and it's just really easy to look down and see like where your money is going. And then also, the other thing I recommend is having a separate bank account. So again, you want to have your business money separate from your personal money. It makes it so much easier to manage. I have my business account in our local credit union, and I set my account up so I have all these sub accounts. And so I've got like a checking account, and that's where I pay all my credit card bill, right? So I'm covering all of my expenses every month. And in the savings part of the account, I have like 5 or 6 sub accounts. And I have an account where Etsy deposits my money. And then I also have my money from like my courses that are paid with PayPal or Stripe coming into there. So all of my income, my revenue is coming into my bank account, into one account. And then when I do my banking at the end of the month, I separate my money that's come in to pay my expenses, right? So you're covering all that, like your cost of goods sold, like those kinds of things. are getting paid for. And then that profit that you ended up with, remember I talked about like that $104. So, you know, all of that money, I don't figure out what it is like per item, but I know that once I pay my expenses, the money that's left is that profit, that 104 for that one particular journal. But from the money that's left, I need to divvy that up. And I divvy that up into these sub-accounts. So I have one for taxes. I never want to be short on paying my taxes. So depending where you live, you'll have to decide like how much to hold back. But I hold back 30% of that money. And so far for the last couple of years that I've had my Etsy shop, I've been like right on with saving 30%. Usually it's between like 25 and 30%, again, like depending where you live. So big chunk goes into my tax sub account. And then I put a little bit in a profit account. So that's another like little sub account that I pay into. And that's money that I use to pay for things in my business. Like when I had to buy a new printer, I use the money in that account. If I take a course or something, or I join a membership for my business, I pay from that profit account. And then what's left after all of those, you know, things are paid for, the expenses, the profit, the taxes, then what's left is my paycheck. And I have a separate sub account that is my paycheck account. That's the money you get to actually keep, and that's the money that you make. So that covered a whole lot. I know this video is super, super long. I hope that it made sense to you and I covered everything I wanted to cover. Let me know if you have any questions about any of that, and I'd be happy to do like a follow-up video if needed. Like I said, I'm going to have a link to a PDF that will have that formula that we did on this sheet of paper for you, so you can print it out and check out your pricing and see where you're at with that. Thank you guys so much for watching. The next few videos in this series, I think I'm going to start talking a bit about marketing and selling your journals and sharing your work, getting your work out there, especially using my favorite platform, Instagram. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful vehicle for sharing your work. And I'm going to talk a bit about using Instagram and why I think it is really essential to build a community and a following for your work as a key component to selling with ease. So I hope you guys will join in following this series. Again, let me know if you have any questions. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate all of you, and I will see you really soon. Bye.